Welcome to Victory Over Communism with Bill Gertz, the only program willing to pull back the curtain of communism to reveal how China and even America's own brand of Marxism pose real threats to freedom and democracy in America and the world today. Your host and guide to victory over communism is one of the nation's most experienced national security journalists, Bill Gertz, who uses unique facts, pinpoint analysis, and exclusive interviews to identify and counter today's destructive communist ideologies. Now, Victory Over Communism with your host, Bill Gertz.
Welcome to the podcast. The VOC podcast is about ideology, Chinese communist ideology, and American Marxism. I like to emphasize at the top of the program that the podcast is not about people. People are free to believe in whatever they choose. The goal of the VOC podcast is to educate people of the United States and around the world to the true nature of these destructive ideologies, and then to offer a counterproposal, something that goes beyond traditional anti-communism. This episode is about American Marxism and how it is gradually subverting the American system of liberty, freedom, and free markets. I'm drawing for this episode on a report from November 2022 by the Heritage Foundation called How Cultural Marxism Threatens the United States and How Americans Can Fight It. It was written by Heritage Foundation expert Mike Gonzalez, who has been a guest on the podcast, and Katherine Gorka, a former Department of Homeland Security official and an expert on security topics. You'll hear in the interview portion an interview with Katie Gorka. The United States in the past successfully turned away Marxist attempts to take over the United States. In 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved, many believed communism had been defeated. They were wrong. American Marxists were not defeated and are now driving to take power in the United States under the cloak of social justice. They are working systematically toward dismantling the foundations of the American Republic. They are trying to rewrite history, promote a new form of racism, create privileged classes, and limit free speech to the point that there are unconstitutional restrictions today on what can be said in public discourse, in the military, and in houses of worship. Marxist ideology must be defeated again, or today's Marxists and neo-Marxists will succeed where the Soviet Union failed. They will have subjugated the United States under a totalitarian, soul-destroying ideology. Marxism was promoted in the 1800s by Karl Marx and put into practice by Vladimir Lenin beginning in 1917, under the rubric of defending the working class against what it regarded as the evil of capitalism. Here, I must note that capitalism, or a better term, the free market system, has produced the greatest advancement of the human condition in all of human history. The problems that exist in today's society are not the result of that economic system. Marxists, however, regard capitalism as the target for destruction under their ideology and its replacement with socialism that is merely a way station on the road to this utopian communist workers' paradise. The practice of socialism and communism, however, has produced untold death and misery in every place it has been imposed. The death toll has been a staggering 60 million people or more, and today hundreds of millions of people, in China especially, remain under its yoke. For the United States, communists struggled with the problem that workers in the West really refused to wage revolution because they believed it would ultimately hinder their own economic interests and diminish their freedoms. Marxism thus was forced to evolve and find other revolutionary agents, such as Marxism and feminism, Marxism and transgenderism, Marxism and deconstruction, Marxism and race. This is the similar formula used by the Chinese communists that rejected Soviet communism in favor of an ideologically flexible brand of communism that allowed the country ultimately to prosper. Right now, however, under Xi Jinping, it is retrenching into hardline Marxism-Leninism, and its economy and system are showing signs of strain. The dominant feature today is identity-based Marxism of the 21st century here in the United States. The struggle is no longer to be based on economic class, but on identity, based on what Gonzalez and Gorka say are ascribed characteristics such as race, sex, national origin that are inherited at birth and over which people have no control. The reasons are simple. Economic classes fluctuate, especially under capitalism, where people can and often do change their stations in life. Race, sex, and national origin are, however, immutable. They are thus superior loci of revolutionary change. This is why the new Marxism emerged victorious on college campuses and elsewhere in the American cultural centers starting in the late 1980s. Whereas it had failed when it relied on social class and guns. This new mutation of Marxism has been described as cultural and thus cultural Marxism. I prefer the term neo-Marxism. It began to be debated and written about in the 1920s and the 1930s, when Antonio Gramsci of Italy and the so-called Frankfurt School in Germany. But this brand of Marxism only came to fruition in the late 60s when Gramsci was first translated into English, and the Frankfurt School's Herbert Marcuse came to prominence among university students. Gramsci was translated by the British journal The New Left Review, and Marcuse came to be known as the guru of the New Left. These are the roots of the new mutation formulated by the 60s New Left radicals. The strategy to achieve the new Marxism was also no longer predicated on Marx's original path of the violent overthrow of the system by the working class, or in Marx and Engels' own words, formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of bourgeois supremacy, and conquest of political power by the proletariat. Instead, the strategy now draws on Gramsci's concepts that ideologues must infiltrate institutions and all of society and raise the consciousness of the oppressed with a new cultural worldview or narrative. Marxism failed in Western societies when it relied on economic status and violence, but this time it has a real chance of succeeding. This is the reason that Marxism today presents a far more serious and existential threat to the United States than Soviet communism did during the Cold War. Neo-Marxism targeted the education system, and as a result, masses of America's youths were raised on a diet of false ideas that are now directly undermining the American system. They are not taught individual rights so much as group rights. They are not taught that the United States, with its free markets and property rights, has brought more prosperity to more people than any nation on earth. They are not taught that generation after generation has worked to achieve the founder's ideal that all men are created equal. They are taught that America is systematically racist, that its very laws are designed to uphold something called white supremacy, which refers not to the vile notion that the white race is supreme, but to all Western traditions, codes, societal arrangements, laws, and norms. Many Americans are today experiencing firsthand the effect of the poison that is being fed to their children in schools, and nearly all parents are allowing their children to be continually bombarded by these anti-American, anti-reality, and counterfactual ideas through movies, television shows, books, comics, games, social media, search engines, and the news feed on their iPhones. As I've noted in previous podcasts, and this is a central focus of the program, the destruction of these values is rooted in atheism and materialism. This is the notion there is no God and that all the world is based on material and not spirit. The ideas of the Marxists are steeped in this atheism and materialism, and it is the reason for the decline and in some cases the complete elimination of God-centered values that are the basis for the success of the American dream. A growing number of Americans are becoming aware of the depth of this infiltration of their culture by our insidious ideas. Americans need to understand the threat and then reverse the tide of Marxism to ensure that more of the public understands both the roots and consequences of these ideas. Looking back, for nearly 70 For nearly 70 years, Marx and Engels' vision of industrial workers inevitably unleashing revolution never came about. In 1917, Lenin and the Bolshevik terrorists were able to bring this vision to fruition in Russia, and they did so through the self-conscious introduction of state terror. Using a similar combination of tyranny and terror, Mao Zedong was able to impose communism on China, as Castro did on Cuba, Kim Il-sung on North Korea, and so on. None of these states were industrialized societies. However, Marx and Engels had so insisted that communism must come from the industrialized nations that they called for a bourgeois transition before communists could attempt a revolution. None were able to galvanize workers to their cause, so Gramsci, the founder of Italy's Communist Party, was one of the first to propose a solution. He argued that workers had accepted the cultural institutions of their bourgeois oppressors and therefore effectively imposed their own enslavement on themselves. As Gonzalez and Gorka state, Gramsci wrote that workers had developed a false consciousness. The worker remained faithful to God, loyal to his family, patriotic to his nation, and he liked his private property. All things that Marx had said needed to be abolished. As Marcuse wrote years later in his essay on repressive tolerance, false consciousness has become the general consciousness. A key moment took place in 1960. That's when C. Wright Mills, an influential sociologist at Columbia University, wrote a seminal article titled Letter to the New Left. In the letter, he appears to have provided a name, the New Left, for a movement that wanted to bring about radical change, but independently of Soviet communism in Moscow. Mills dismissed the Soviet focus on the worker as Victorian Marxism and even vulgar Marxism. Instead, Mills wrote, "Who is it that is thinking and acting in radical ways? All over the world, in the bloc, outside the bloc, in between, the answer is the same. It is the young intelligentsia." He recognized that in many places around the world it was not workers, but young people who were in fact sparking revolution. And by highlighting that fact, he provided inspiration to a generation of middle-class white students in the United States that they could become agents of revolutionary change. This argument took root because the ground had been prepared for years by the New Left's precursors. American students had been fed a steady stream of content critical of American power and prosperity, mainly written by socialists or inspired by socialist ideas. Then came the radicals of the 1970s and the anti-Vietnam War movement that produced the Weather Underground terrorism. These groups then dissolved or were disbanded by the 1980s in favor of the new tactic. Their acceptance that revolution was futile was soothed by their new understanding that they could still overthrow society, but they would do so by infiltrating the institutions and acculturating Americans to such Marxist ideas as abolishing the family, property, the nation-state, and God. They would have to burrow in. By the late 1980s, the penetration of American universities had reached a new level of power and influence. The now middle-aged radicals were deeply embedded within the faculties of university campuses they'd once disrupted. The radicals were now in positions of power as professors, but also had trained 2 decades of students in their radical ideologies. Now those students were developing their own radical ideas and casting aside the older generation. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the rejection of the mostly white male professors of law who had established something called critical legal studies, CLS. The CLS movement, by heavily minority and female professors of law who created critical race theory. This was the key in transition from the Marxism of the New Left that was ascendant in the 60s and 70s to the next generation of Marxism that took hold in the 1980s and had its coming out party in 1989. That's when CRT, critical race theory, was first named and formally founded. It happened at a convention held at a convent in Madison, Wisconsin. When black and other non-white law faculty and students were members of the CLS movement, struck out on their own, establishing CRT as a race-based offshoot of critical legal theory. The foundational role of Karl Marx and Antonio Gramsci in the emergence of this new Marxism was revealed in a published interview with Richard Delgado, a Mexican-American law professor who helped found CRT. He said of CRT's ironic beginnings in a religious setting, "So we're gathered at the convent for 2.5 days around a table in an austere room with stained glass windows and crucifixes here and there, an odd place for a bunch of Marxists, and worked out a set of principles." The 1980s were the point at which the Marxist left made a pivot from class-based or economic Marxism to neo-Marxism. An alternative name for this phenomena is woke Marxism. Today's Marxists believe that the reason economic, social, cultural, academic, and health outcomes, to name just a few, show persistent racial disparities is because of a pervasive systemic racism that can only be eliminated by smashing the system itself. The quickest way to do that is to create a never-ending number of racial and country of origin categories such as Hispanics and Asian Americans, both created by government fiat in 1977 at the insistence of leftist activists, the members of which would be instilled with grievances about the disparity of these outcomes, to the point that they will want to become active soldiers in smashing the system. The Marxist narrative that all of society for all of history has been divided into categories of the oppressed and their oppressors is played out over and over. The government and all society, the purveyors of CRT say, must thus treat people not as individuals with liberty, but as categories that deserve special treatment and benefits as members of these categories. What is happening today, therefore, is nothing more than the age's identity category version of Marx's 19th century claim that because individuals have different abilities and because they belong to different classes, their rights must differ. According to Marx, if government or society in general were to grant people equal individual rights, such as consumption and services, material inequality, the bugaboo of all Marxists then and now, would ensue. Another reason why Marx thought that government needed to distribute goods and services unequally until the point of communism was reached in its final stage, something that was an elusive target date, was that socialism inherits inequalities from capitalism that can't be wished away. Fast forward to today and noted anti-racist Ibram X. Kendi, who declares that the only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. The government, Kendi, a retail promoter of CRT, is saying must discriminate in favor of the members of the category deemed oppressed. But as Thomas Klingenstein of the Claremont Institute rightly observed, a free society will necessarily lead to different outcomes. The more outcome equality, the less freedom there is. Marx was an economic determinist who believed that the different outcomes depended on different classes, and these depended on their relationship to the factors of production. Basing their views on race and other immutable traits, America's Marxists explain the different outcomes in terms of categories that are racial and sexual. To them, the racial disparities they claim are at the root of society happen because the dominant set of practices and institution, the rules for construction of all authorized institutions and activity, codify white supremacy. To Marxists, all rules, norms, behaviors, traditions, mores, and Western civilization constitute white supremacy. White supremacy to these Marxists is totalizing. It is the American Revolution, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, the Reformation, everything. It is that which needs to be torn down. Capitalism, for both earlier Marxists as well as today's, must be demolished. For Marx, because he sought the abolition of private property. For cultural Marxists, because it rewards the wrong norms and forms of conduct. Today's American neo-Marxists adapted Marx's foundational concepts. Marx believed that revolutions would inevitably result in the material forces of production in society come into conflict with existing relations of production. Neo-Marxists, abandoning economic determinism, substitute culture for economy and racial and sexual identities as the proletariat. They agree with Gramsci that popular beliefs and similar ideas are themselves material forces, and immutable traits such as race will now trump class. To the 21st century communist Eric Mann, the racialization of all aspects of political life operates as a material force in itself. American Marxism is thus remodeled Marxism, a mutation, but it is Marxism nonetheless, something Americans in the 21st century need to understand. It is entirely distinct from other forms of garden variety left liberalism, whose proponents are being displaced by Marxists. In the Democratic Party, for example, socialist members of the so-called squad, such as Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Cori Bush, they received levels of attention denied their moderate colleagues, such as Representative Henry Cuellar and Carolyn Boudreaux. The Marxist goal is not to improve the system, but to overturn the existing social order entirely, which they consider to be the enforcer of white supremacy. Because of that absolutism, Marxism cannot tolerate or coexist with other worldviews. It demands censorship, which began as political correctness, but has since veered into the far more insidious censorship, which leads inevitably to tyranny. As Marxism has everywhere it has been tied, it punishes alternative views by attempting to drive those who express them from public life, a phenomenon we now call cancel culture, which is real. A review of the internal workings of Twitter after it was bought by Elon Musk are a case in point. Conservative views were systematically censored by the content moderators. I don't know if they were Marxists, but it is very likely that they were either Marxists or neo-Marxists of the American variety. As Klingenstein of Claremont said, if the woke comms want to overthrow our system, we have to overthrow theirs. The new Marxists play for keeps, just as the old ones did. Marx's favorite phrase came from Goethe's Mephisto, the devil. Everything that exists deserves to perish. Marxists took over the universities and transformed the class struggle into one over race, sex, and other immutable traits, and used these positions of power to reinterpret not just history itself, but reality itself. Marxists also abandoned the violent struggle in favor of indoctrination. Socialism evolved from preaching government ownership of the means of production to putting socialists in charge of the means of meaning production. The capture of the university has paid huge dividends, for it is from the university that so much of a nation's culture emanates. But the takeover by Marxism has been far more totalizing. In fact, sex, sexual orientation, climate, and other issues have been used indiscriminately to advance revolutionary goals, something that Marxists themselves sometimes admit. Former Marxist David Horowitz, who was interviewed on this program, for example, quotes an SDS radical of the 70s as having once written, "The issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution." Horowitz explains, in other words, the cause, whether inner city blacks or women, is never the real cause, but an occasion to advance the real cause, which is the accumulation of power to make revolution. Eric Mann, the communist and former weatherman who trained Black Lives Matter co-founder Patrisse Cullors for a decade on Marxism-Leninism and how to be an organizer, drove this point home when he told an interviewer in 2015 that whether the issue is race, sex, gender, or the environment, the goal is overthrowing the U.S. system, and the rest is just a little division of labor. A few examples of what this looks like in practice should suffice to demonstrate the impact the cultural Marxists have had. On education, the universities today have almost completely succumbed to the ideology imposed by those who have followed the cultural Marxist pioneers of the 80s. As the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression pointed out in the 2022 to 2023 College Free Speech rankings, 42% of conservative students say are most likely to feel they cannot express their opinions, compared to 13% of liberal students saying the same. The university officials most involved with enforcing the Marxist ideology generally fall under the heading of diversity, equity, inclusion. These are positive-sounding terms. Who could be against diversity, equity, and inclusion? But they have been distorted into meaning almost the exact opposite. On sex and gender, the sexual revolution, of which critical theorist Herbert Marcuse was also a guru, have been clearly part of the strategy, as are today the advances of gender theory and critical pedagogy. Gender theory or gender ideology derives from feminism, critical theory, and Marxist Freudian thought. In practice, Marxist academic jargon has had tragic consequences, such as minors being forced to undergo routine amputation of perfectly healthy body parts and hormonal interventions that fill young bodies with toxins. These are deeply invasive and often irreversible procedures that destroy functioning and alter visible physical structures, explained former heritage analyst Ryan Anderson. And here again, the institutions in charge of the culture exercise their ruthless censorship over those who would dare to question the new Marxist regime. In February 2021, Amazon banned sales of the book When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment. On climate, America's wars over climate are also part of the Marxist strategy. No less a figure than Greenpeace founder Patrick Moore says he walked away from environmentalism in the late 1980s because it was taken over by Marxists. In many cases, those who are seeking environmental advances are really looking to control. They're looking for government control over all aspects of society. It's vital to understand exactly what cultural Marxists are in the process of trying to destroy. The Marxist lust for societal destruction would annihilate not an old and immoral European monarchy or a czarist empire or a corrupt third world dictatorship, but they would destroy one of humankind's most successful and noble experiments, the United States. It's been an immeasurable force for good for Americans and the world. The fundamental purpose of the United States, as conceived by the founders, was to create the optimum conditions for human flourishing. The founders drew from the knowledge and experience of millennia to craft a society in which they believed the greatest good could accrue to the greatest number. They never set out to create a perfect society. They knew that sin and imperfection affected all people, and therefore perfection on this earth was not possible. But they believed they could create a better political order than the monarchies and aristocracies that existed at the time by learning from and building on what had come before. They respected self-governance. They recognized fallen humanity. They checked ambition with ambition. They recognized individuals' rights and the right to private property, as well as the rights of minorities. And they believed strongly in limiting the power of government. What the founders crafted succeeded far beyond what most Europeans of the time expected. Never has a country been established with such high aspirations and unbridled optimism. Indeed, never had a country been created with such forethought and planning. What emerged was a country deeply and profoundly committed to the ordered liberty, and also to the idea that God must play a central role in the affairs of people. As the Pledge of Allegiance, once required in daily recitation by school children, states, "One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." That spirit of aspiration and optimism emboldened America's founding fathers to write into the founding documents what Martin Luther King Jr. would later describe as the promissory note of equality. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, King said in his famous speech on the front of Lincoln Memorial, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'll be right back with the counterproposal section that offers a way to defeat American Marxism.
You're listening to Victory Over Communism with your host, Bill Gertz, featuring exclusive interviews with today's top newsmakers and trendsetters. Stand by for more after these important messages.
Hi, this is Bill Gertz. I wanted to talk to you briefly about my latest book. It's called Deceiving the Sky: Inside Communist China's Drive for Global Supremacy. This is the most important book you can read to fully understand the threat posed by the Chinese Communist government. I urge you to get a copy today. It can be found at my website, The Gertz File. That's gertzfile.com, or at the book site called deceivingthesky.com.
If you enjoy listening to Victory Over Communism with your host, Bill Gertz, please consider helping Bill with his important work of educating patriots just like you about how communism is very real and even more dangerous than ever before. Your donation to the Victory Over Communism program will help expand its reach across America and throughout the world. In fact, you'll be helping to provide the kind of information that may well make its way behind the new Iron Curtain and the Great Firewall of China and inspire those living under communism to seek freedom. Supporting the Victory Over Communism program is easy. Just visit the program website, victoryovercommunism.net, and click on the link at the bottom to gofundme.com. Again, just visit victoryovercommunism.net and click on the link to gofundme.com. Thanks for listening, and God bless America.
You're listening to Victory Over Communism, featuring exclusive interviews with today's top newsmakers and trendsetters. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back. This is the counterproposal section of the podcast that is based on the teachings of the late Reverend Sun Myung Moon, who understood communism to be fundamentally an anti-God ideology. He offered a pro-God ideology that seeks to solve the problems communism seeks to address. Efforts to oppose the advance of communism have been important, but the problem is that the West is on the defensive in what is clearly an ideological war. My book, I War, War and Peace in the Information Age, reveals that the free, democratic world is engaged in a new kind of warfare, one that doesn't involve guns or bombs, but information and electrons. It is the kind of warfare that will dominate the 21st century, the Russian invasion of Ukraine notwithstanding. Anti-communism is defensive in nature and has been unable to resolve the problem of communism. A strategy for victory over communism is what is urgently needed in the West. Even though Soviet communism ended, Chinese communism and American neo-Marxism are on the rise globally, and the free world remains on the defensive ideologically. We urgently need new tools to confront communism and defeat it ideologically. That new tool is what I call the VOC worldview. It's a Judeo-Christian ideology based on the divine principle of Reverend Moon, who is the founder of the Washington Times. VOC theory exquisitely dissects the falsehoods of communism. For example, the fundamental guiding thesis of communism and socialism is that global capitalism, led by the free and democratic United States, is the ultimate source of world evil. Social justice, injustice, inequality, and other perceived societal ills. The VOC view presents a faith-based counterproposal that identifies the true source of the world's problems as spiritual in nature, stemming from a fundamental lack of understanding God. How humankind separated from God, and God's ideal and goals for bringing humanity out of the current confusion, chaos, and turmoil into a world of true peace and freedom. The elements of this worldview include new principles that clearly help to understand the purpose and goal of all humans, how God's ideal for humankind was lost through the fall of the first human ancestors, and how God has been systematically working throughout history to bring humankind back to its original God-centered position through the providence of restoration. The worldview provides hope for challenging the new advance of communism. This approach is effective in two ways. First, it carefully examines the ideology of communism and exposes its lies and deception. Second, it presents a counterproposal to communism. It offers a powerful, logical, and philosophical affirmation of the existence of God, which is essential for modern-day human intellectual and spiritual development. By vividly presenting God and his purpose in creation and human history, this worldview enlightens, inspires, and motivates people of conscience. This worldview presents a solution to communism at its core. The VOC theory calls for change in the West as well as in the communist world. The teachings recognize that under capitalism, exploitation and economic inequalities exist in the world. This exploitation results from a narrow and selfish perspective of value. Corruption and a failure to understand the nature of God and his will in the West assisted communism in its development and bolstered its appeals and calls for violent revolution. It is corruption in the West that allows communism to offer itself as a liberator to deliver developing nations what Marxists call imperialist oppression. As long as selfishness and materialism are unchecked in the West, there's little hope of bringing an end to communism. The fundamental fallacy of communism is in the solution to the world's ills, is changing the economic system of capitalism that communists link to the root of all evils. The VOC worldview teaches that capitalism that has brought immense prosperity and freedom to the world is not the problem. The problem lies within the human spirit. Only by resolving the contradictions within human beings brought about by separation from God can evil be eliminated. The VOC worldview provides a two-edged ideological sword. One edge seeks to dispel the myths about communism and expose its evil, and the other edge works for the end of the problems in the democratic world. In this way, Western civilization can be restored to the God-centered tradition upon which true democracy and freedom can flourish. Victory over communism proposes to inspire through education a dramatic change in the West. This change can be achieved through a spiritual revolution in free societies and ultimately throughout the world. By eliminating selfishness, a true revolution of spirit can be realized. Unless humankind changes, nothing is going to change. But once humankind is changed, men and women who understand the nature of God and God's original relationship with his lost family, society will advance toward a new moral world of peace and prosperity, justice, equality, and freedom under God. The VOC worldview is the key to resolving moral confusion in the Western system of values. This is accomplished first by providing a new ideological framework for Western thought. The worldview then reassures people regarding the true purpose of life and urges the establishment of a harmonious relationship with the Creator. This spiritual counterproposal is based on the foundation of Judeo-Christian tradition that teaches humans are reconciled to God through the saving work of Christ. But at the same time, this counterproposal is not incompatible with other great faiths of the world, each which stress the need for a union between humankind and God. When the human heart and spirit are satisfied by God's love and truth, and when the practice of God's love has eliminated social injustice, then humanity will pass beyond the challenge of communism and its atheistic and materialistic variants. There is no room for communism in human life. Ultimately, the appeal of communism will be totally lost. Communism, based on an anti-God ideology, is an internationally organized and militant anti-religious movement. Religious people in the West, on the other hand, have been scattered and unmotivated. More than this, the religious world has been weakened by division and petty infighting. This is a tragic situation. It is imperative for God-loving people to stand together on the front line and fight against the anti-religious force of communism. VOC theory is a powerful unifying antidote to the anti-God ideology of communism and is able to bring God-loving people together. It's not based on doctrine, but rather on common sense. Therefore, these revolutionary teachings are able to bring together God-affirming and conscientious people beyond color or creed. All humankind should be united, for all began as children of God. Beyond religious, cultural, and national differences, we are one family under one parent, God. We must defend our heritage from a common enemy. This is the basic motivation for the development of the victory over communism outlook, sometimes referred to as Godism. This is the counterproposal that each podcast strives to convey. The time's now come for Western civilization to hear and embrace this message, and it is a message that is being embraced around the world by tens of millions of people. America's greatness and pride stem from God. With Him, America deserves the blessing and can remain as the mightiest nation. With God, you can preserve your dignity and the leadership of the world. If we allow God to leave America, however, this nation will decline. It will be subjugated by satanic hands. When this happens, the future of America will be dismal and tragic. America will become a living hell. Religious and political leaders both have been able to see how this new movement can end the ideological confusion in the West, turn the tide of the Western retreat, and provide the drive and determination to pursue the cause of freedom. The Victory Over Communism podcast is a vital source for those who wish to understand Marxism-Leninism, its dangerous and destructive social implications, and learn the God-centered worldview that is absolutely essential to countering the advance of communism and stimulating a moral renaissance throughout the entire world. I'll be right back after a short break.
You're listening to Victory Over Communism with your host, Bill Gertz, featuring exclusive interviews with today's top newsmakers and trendsetters.
Welcome back. For the news portion, I'm going to look at a major new report made public recently by the State Department's Global Engagement Center, the official counter-disinformation office. The GEC, as it's known, has come under criticism for not producing relevant material, really not waging the kind of information war that's been waged against the United States. The State Department's Inspector General said in a recent report that it lacked focus and was saddled with poor leadership. Most of its reports were on Russia. Well, the new report states clearly, and for the first time by any administration, that China poses a threat to world freedom and is seeking information dominance in a bid to promote its Marxist-Leninist ideology as a replacement for the democratic and free market system in the West. China, the report said, is engaged in a massive global campaign to promote the communist system and to counter dissenting voices. After decades of promoting mainly positive narratives about China to the world through broadcasting and print media, the ruling Chinese Communist Party today has altered its approach under the present leader, Xi Jinping. Beijing has shifted to embracing the coordinated use of disinformation when it suits its purposes, often using inauthentic bot networks to amplify its message. The 58-page report said it describes the operations as highly sophisticated media and government influence underwritten by billions of dollars in investment. By contrast, the only thing the U.S. has is the global radios that we have, and they get about $700 million a year and are doing a lot of fluff and not being effective. The GEC report identifies multiple elements of Chinese government information manipulation and influence activities, including propaganda and censorship, the promotion of digital authoritarianism to control online content, and the infiltration and control of international organizations and bilateral relationships. Jamie Rubin, the GEC director, told reporters that the report comprehensively examines how the People's Republic of China attempts to distort the global information environment through its influence and disinformation activities. When you look at the pieces of the puzzle and you put it all together, you see a breathtaking ambition on the part of the PRC to seek information dominance in key regions of the world. Rubin said, China's ultimate goal is to damage the security and stability of the United States and its allies. The information age has produced a dark side, he said. Foreign disinformation and manipulation efforts, unless halted, will slowly and steadily destroy democratic values and rights. According to the GEC report, the Chinese are also using co-optation of former government officials and business people and journalists through bribery to promote false or biased narratives promoted by Beijing. Collectively, these elements erode the integrity of the information environment, the report said. Disinformation, used in the past as a supporting role in Beijing's overall foreign policy, has now become a central feature of Chinese influence operation. Examples are stories questioning the origin of the COVID-19 virus, criticism of the trilateral US-UK-Australian Accord on submarine construction, and Russia's justifications for its invasions of Ukraine. Major disinformation and influence operations defend Chinese policy towards Taiwan and counter what the State Department has called the policy of genocide against minority Uyghurs in Western China. Covert Chinese intelligence personnel have planted false stories in foreign media, and diplomats have pressured foreign media to promote the Chinese regime's favored narratives. China is also buying foreign media outlets and using them for its operations. The report warns that Beijing's efforts are diminishing freedom of expression, and they're manipulating international information outlets into becoming tools of the Chinese propaganda system. Unless effectively countered, information in the future available to the general public, media, civil society, academia, and governments will be distorted and based on false or misleading information produced by China. This future is not a foregone conclusion, the report said, noting the growing global consensus for countering Chinese influence campaigns. The stakes are high. If the PRC's global narratives ultimately prevail, it will encounter less resistance to shaping the international order to the detriment of individual liberties and national sovereignty around the world. This is really something that's become what the Chinese are calling a new long march. The Xi Jinping government has launched the new long march to battle what one Communist Party influencer, Yi Fan, claims are malicious lies in the West about China's systems and policy. The Long March was the campaign led by Mao Zedong in the 1930s that ultimately led to the communists seizing power in 1949. This report is the first official U.S. government publication to highlight the work of the ruling Communist Party's United Front Work Department. This is an overt and covert influence arm that's engaged in transnational repression, mainly against ethnic Chinese living outside of China. The United Front agents harass and coerce critics of Beijing under the direct control of the Communist Party's Central Committee, a senior leadership organ. Xi Jinping has expanded United Front activities, calling them critical to maintaining and increasing Chinese power. Since coming to power in 2012, he significantly increased funding for the United Front Work Department and elevated central coordination of its efforts to shape the international environment, including the information domain, to Beijing's advantage. United Front agents also work with Chinese secret police in the Ministry of State Security. The ministry uses the front of operational cover to conduct influence operations. Other main organs for the global manipulation campaign is the CCP Central Propaganda Department, said to be exporting domestic information controls to countries around the world. The United Front Work Department commands a vast media apparatus that floods overseas Chinese language spaces with pro-Beijing rhetoric. Chinese officials use more than 333 official and diplomatic accounts on the social media site X to promote disinformation and propaganda. In Britain, a single coordinated network of dozens of accounts produced 44% of all tweets of the Chinese ambassador to Britain. That's kind of how their bot networks work. The Chinese government also has paid local news outlet in East Africa to publish favorable articles in exchange for cash, with an agreement not to disclose the arrangement. China also uses social media influencers to promote its agenda. Nearly 100 people post pro-regime content in 24 languages, reaching an estimated 11 million people. Beijing employs bots, trolls, coordinated campaigns among inauthentic social media accounts to boost propaganda and suppress critical content. They use a technique called flooding to manipulate search engine results and minimize hashtag searches. The result is that Chinese propagandists can drown out online information on topics they oppose and spread unrelated content that limits fact-based information from reaching people. Recent PRC flooding campaigns include an attempt to hijack the Genocide Games hashtag during the 2022 Winter Olympics to marginalize efforts by foreign activists to raise awareness of the PRC's genocides and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. The Chinese use online and real-world intimidation and harassment of critics to silence dissent and encourage self-censorship. Beijing authorities identify and control accounts of online critics domestically and overseas. U.S. officials have identified how Chinese authorities work with companies in China to identify and locate critics abroad who seek to work anonymously. The report said the owner of the popular video sharing app TikTok, ByteDance, also blocked critics of China from using its platform. According to U.S. government information, as of late 2020, ByteDance maintained a regularly updated internal list identifying people who are likely blocked or restricted from all ByteDance platforms, including TikTok, for reasons such as advocating for Uyghur independence. ByteDance also blacklisted people who were viewed as posing risks of spreading criticism of Beijing. To further expand its influence, Chinese leaders target foreign political elites, often former political leaders and retired government officials, by offering seats on corporate boards and academic appointments to mute elite criticism of the regime. China recruited former European and Latin American national leaders to support Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, an infrastructure financing program that U.S. officials say has been used to promote the benefits of China's communist system in the developed world. China has successfully cultivated foreign journalists to promote Beijing narratives through paid travel to China, professional residencies, and graduate education. Some participants were given clear instructions from PRC interlocutors about how they should report both during their trips and afterwards. Some participants later incorporate PRC talking points into their reporting, enabling Beijing to advance its preferred narratives without direct attribution. The hugely popular Chinese messaging app WeChat also is used for propaganda and disinformation. The PRC's success in exercising control over Chinese language media is a cautionary harbinger of its larger efforts, how its larger efforts could ultimately shape the global information environment, the report concluded. I'll be right back with the interview portion after a short break.
You're listening to Victory Over Communism with your host, Bill Gertz, featuring exclusive interviews with today's top newsmakers and trendsetters. Stand by for more after these important messages.
I spoke to you earlier about my book, Deceiving the Sky. I also wanted to urge you to take a look at another book that I wrote called iWar, War and Peace in the Information Age. We live in an information age, and yet we're getting bombarded with enemy propaganda coming at us from all different directions. iWar really helps expose what we need to do and how we need to counter it. I urge you to get a copy. The book can be found at iwarbook.com or at my website, gertzfile.com.
You're listening to Victory Over Communism with your host, Bill Gertz, featuring exclusive interviews with today's top newsmakers and trendsetters. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back. For the interview portion of the program, I'm joined now by Katherine Gorka, former Department of Homeland Security official and also a former Heritage Foundation expert on American Marxism. She co-wrote the Heritage Report mentioned earlier in the podcast. Katie, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Bill, so great to be here. I'm a big fan of the podcast.
Well, thanks. Your report was a fascinating look at cultural Marxism and how it was adapted from the likes of Gramsci and Marcuse. Tell us a little bit about how you see this new form of Marxism and its infiltration and subversion of the United States.
Right. Well, I think the really important point is that those who embraced, full-blown Marxism and kind of took the old-fashioned route of confrontation found that it just wasn't working. And honestly, this has been the experience historically. Marxism really doesn't take hold in industrial countries because the bottom line is workers, even if they're not happy, they know they have opportunity, right? They know that they have the possibility to achieve and to prosper and to do well. So of course they don't want to tear down that system. So, eventually the old school Marxists had to abandon their strategy, and they picked up on the strategy that Antonio Gramsci had developed. Now, he looked at the same problem in Italy, right? That Marxism, the Marxist revolution, failed in Italy in the early part of the century. And so he felt that what you had to do was a more subtle approach where you infiltrate the culture and you change the culture from the inside. That's the Gramscian approach. Rudi Dutschke called it the march through the long march through the institutions. And the idea being take over the important key cultural institutions and start to change the culture that way. And once you've turned the culture, boom, your job is done. So what happens with the 60s radicals with their failed revolution of 1968 and their failed terrorist tactics of the Weather Underground? They did one of two things. A small group went into the Weather Underground and then eventually ended up in academia, right? They ended up in universities. And another group basically went the community organizing route. And through these two methods, I have to say they very effectively infiltrated our institutions. Now, obviously, I'm really simplifying the story and a lot more happened there, but that is in essence what happened.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, they did make I remember, back in the in 68 Democratic Convention, the radicals got their heads cracked by the Chicago police and they said, we're not doing this. We're going to make the long march to the institutions. I think they kind of reached their zenith during the Obama administration and now furthermore in the Biden administration, where we're hearing openly Marxist slogans or Marxist originated slogans, and this new cultural Marxism or neo-Marxism is gaining ground. And obviously, I think that the starting point for that, as you mentioned in your report, was going after the universities, where they became professors and then they were able to influence the students and also influence over the long term the ability. Tell us about a little bit about how they focused on the universities as a starting point for this new style of Marxism.
Yeah, well, I'll just point out one particular thread of what happened in the universities. And again, there were many threads, many paths, but I'll tell you about one that I think is particularly important, and that is, again, you had a group of 60s radicals who realized that their revolution was failing. They weren't achieving the types of civil rights reforms that they wanted. So they believed the only way to bring about change was through the law, using the law. So they went to law school. They became law professors. They created something called critical legal theory. This was using the law basically to implement Marxism. Now, the interesting thing is they did this, at our major universities. They did this for about 20 years, but these were predominantly white men. They're not 100%, but predominantly white men. And what happened is the students that they cultivated, who were, included many minority students, many African Americans, Hispanics, and others, after about 20 years or so, they said, enough of this. we don't want this practice, this critical legal theory dominated by white men. We're taking over. And that was the beginning of critical race theory, where they basically booted out the white men from the club. They said, we're in charge now. And that was incredibly instrumental. And honestly, it still blows my mind. And, how we have gotten from that, which was in the 1980s, to where we are today, and how pervasive this mentality is just really stunning. I don't know if you saw there was a great piece in the Wall Street Journal by a professor at Boston University. This whole story with Ibram Kendi is kind of blowing up, and his Center for the Study of Anti-Racism is being investigated. He had managed to raise some $50 million, and what did he do with it, right? But what's incredible is, though, even though that center is proving to be a failure, the university is just holding so fast and steady to their diversity, equity, and inclusion paradigm, which is a deeply, profoundly Marxist perspective. And sadly, our universities have really been taken over by this mentality, this version of cultural Marxism.
Yeah, and I think the report kind of really focused on, and to me, this is the main thrust of the American Marxists, is the three main areas. One is racialism, the new racism that they're advocating. Two is the radical gender ideology. I did an earlier podcast on transgender Marxism, and a lot of the violent incidents involving these recent transgenders with shootings and so forth, they've been these transgender Marxists. And then the last is climate change. Can you just briefly hit each of those 3 points and how you see them as factors for the Marxist left promoting their narratives?
Yes. So first, I think the important point here is to say, what is it about these three approaches that is Marxist? Because there are people out there, even on the right, who will say, oh, but what we're seeing is not Marxism because Marx said everything is about economics. Okay, yes, in that sense, that's true Marxism. But I think the more important element of Marxism is its zero-sum view of the world, right? Marx believed that everybody was either an oppressor or they were oppressed. He pitted the whole world against each other, and also that people were reduced to a very sort of singular element of their identity. Now in his case, he said it's all about economics. What they've done today with cultural Marxism is they've reduced it to other simple factors. Like they've said, okay, let's reduce the whole person to their race, or let's reduce the whole person just to their gender. And then having said that, what they're really saying is that we as Americans cannot work together to make this better. They are saying the only way that we are going to make this better is actually if we create a new power structure, a new racism, a new kind of honestly bigotry, and the rest of you people, to hell with you, right? It's a very dark, destructive view of humanity. It's very, very sad and destructive.
Yeah. All right. Last question. The report presents some solutions and ideas for countering this. Give us just a summation of what needs to be done to help counter this kind of neo-Marxism.
Right. Well, it has to happen at both the policy level, but honestly, at the citizen level. So at the policy level, we are already seeing this. A lot of states are stepping up. And they are fighting against things like critical race theory, like the DEI paradigm, and other aspects of Marxism. But, I'm a big believer that really the only way this is going to change is when Americans wake up. And I think this is already happening. I think we're seeing this. Americans have to rekindle the idea that this is a self-governing republic. That means we cannot wait for somebody from Washington to swoop in and fix this for us. The solution lies with each one of us. And I think this is what you're seeing. I think you're seeing a really interesting and exciting kind of reawakening of the true American spirit. Now, I know that many people get frustrated. I mean, I just was having lunch with somebody today who's a historian of the American Revolution, and he feels very frustrated because he says, look, the left has managed to teach a whole generation of American youth that they are oppressed, they are victims, in spite of the fact that they live in the most tolerant, prosperous, and free country in the world. And he says the reason this happened is because the left was on the march and the right was sleeping. We did not address this. We didn't see it coming. We didn't address it. We didn't stop it. I'm an optimist. I say it's not too late, but it means each one of us has to step up and take a role. And I think that's where the real solution lies.
Absolutely. Education is the key. We've been talking with Katherine Gorka, former Department of Homeland Security official and former Heritage Foundation expert on American Marxism. Katie, thanks so much for being on the show.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Bill. Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of Victory Over Communism. Tune in again in a couple of weeks for a new episode.
Thanks for listening to Victory Over Communism with award-winning national security journalist Bill Gertz, the only program in the free world unafraid to pull back the curtain of communism to reveal how the Communist Party of China and even America's own brand of Marxism pose real threats to freedom and democracy in America and the world today. See you next time on Victory Over Communism with your host, Bill Gertz.